Okay. It's a joy to have Phil Borges here. I first was introduced to his work when I watched the TED Talks called Psychosis versus Spirituality. And something moved inside my heart as I was a psychiatrist at Kaiser Permanente, talking to people, diagnosing people with schizophrenia. And the words that Phil spoke during this TED Talk revitalized and activated something in my DNA, a different perspective about psychosis, a different way of looking at this topic. And so it ignited something in me. So about 3 years later, here I am, and it's a joy to be connected to Phil and able to speak some truth about this topic. So I just wanted to open it up for you, Phil, for those people who have not heard of your work. I can briefly introduce you. Phil, from what I've seen, he's done a TED Talk on psychosis and spirituality. He's been an amazing photographer. What I like to my perspective, my vibes is like the spiritual Anthony Bourdain of photography. That's kind of the vibe I've received. Also made an amazing, beautiful film called CrazyWise, which I had the privilege of watching 2 days ago. And I was just, the whole time, my heart was just nodding, saying, thank you. Thank you for shedding light on that topic. Thank you. And it's the way it was directed, the flow of that video, the truths that were revealed naturally and gracefully, and the stories it told of two people going through their journey. The experts who spoke their truth really spoke to my heart, and reignited this passion in my heart. So that's kind of my perspective, but I want to open it up to you, Phil. Just tell the viewers, who is Phil, and where are you at, and what is your mission on this planet?
Well, that I'm constantly asking myself, who am I?
Beautiful.
And trying to get deeper and deeper with that question. And realizing, trying to tap out of the world of duality and into non-duality in my meditation. So in terms of who am I, that's a voyage of discovery.
Beautiful.
But in terms of what I've been doing and what I've done in my life and what brought me to this place is I spent 30 years in tribal and indigenous cultures, mainly doing films and photography around human rights issues. And I was I started with the Tibetan issue because I was very concerned about the Tibetan culture and how it was being dominated by the Chinese culture at this point in time and in the last several years. And so it was more or less around human rights. I've changed my attitude towards that in the last couple of years, but it started there about 30 years ago. And I've been into tribal and indigenous groups all over the world. And while doing different human rights stories on different issues, I began meeting the healers in these communities. And we often call them shaman here in the West, but they go by different names in their different cultures. And I learned a very interesting thing that many of them were identified, usually in their late teens or early 20s, by having a crisis of some sort. And sometimes it was a physical crisis, like a terrible fever or a sickness of some sort that they came close to death. But more often, it was a mental emotional crisis. And when they would describe it to me, it sounded like what we in the West would call a psychosis. They were hearing voices, having visions. They had mood swings at times that were out of the ordinary for them. That many thought they were dying, and they were typically taken aside in the community by an elder. And often it was an older healer, an older shaman that essentially told them, listen, you have a special sensitivity. Yes, it can be difficult, but you have to go through an initiation. We'll put you through an initiation, and that will help you use that sensitivity in helping our community. And they took them through the initiation. And so when I would meet these healers, it had been an initiation they had years before, usually, because I'd usually meet people in their 30s, 40s, sometimes in their 60s. Some women in Siberia I met in their 90s, 80s, late 80s, early 90s. So I never did get a sense of what that initiation was or how it was. And I've never watched an initiation until I did the film CrazyWise. And as you remember, Akaya in the film went through an initiation. She's African American and she has a South African heritage. And she met a Sangoma, a shaman from South Africa. And this woman brought her through an initiation, which changed her radically. So that's been my history and how I got into this subject. I'm still very much investigating it and investigating. I consider this my own spiritual journey as I make these films and do my interviews with different people that go into these states. And I have a lot to say about that, but I'll let you ask me the questions.
I love it. I love it. Well, thank you so much for doing that important work. First of all, I just want to ask you about the Tibetan culture. You know, there's been a lot of kind of, if you want to say, spiritual teachers who have come out of there. And can you tell me a little bit about what you learned about the Tibetan culture and why you feel there's a sense of spiritual kind of teachers who come out of there and what you've noticed about that culture?
Yeah. Well, it was dramatic when I first went there. I went there in the early 90s for the first time. And to get there, you go through New Delhi. And well, first of all, I went to Dharamsala, India, where the Dalai Lama lives and the Tibetan culture in exile is housed. That's where many Tibetans who have escaped from Tibet go. And so this is sort of an exile community. So that's where I first started meeting the Tibetan people. I'd later have gone into Tibet many times and done a couple of books on the Tibetan culture. So that first, I'll never forget the first time I went there. I land in Delhi, you get out of the bus, you get out of the plane, you get on a bus and take it on up to Dharamsala, which is a 20-hour ride. And being in Delhi, just waiting to try and get the bus, everybody's kind of hustling you, help you with your bags so they can make some money here and there. And, you're just used to that when I was in that type of situation. Anyway, I arrive up in Dharamsala at 2 a.m. and I go to find a little guest house to stay. And everybody tells me that everything is full. There's a teaching by the Dalai Lama going on in a couple of days. And so all the guest houses were full. And I met this one guy that said, "Here, let me help you with your bags and I'll find a place for you." And I was desperate. So I said, yes. Usually I wouldn't do that because I know there'd be a big charge at the end.
Sure.
And anyway, this guy took me around to about 4 or 5 places. Young guy, maybe about 25 years old. And we finally found a place that I could stay. And it took us about an hour to find a place, though. So we finally find a place. And as I'm checking in, I turned to him and said, "How much do I owe you for?" No. I just, I'll see you around town sometime. And he just walked off.
Wow.
And I just was shocked. I'm just not used to that. So that was my introduction.
Beautiful.
And then being there was just a magical time for me because First of all, I met a guy that was writing a piece for a Daily Telegraph in London. This was a journalist from London, and we made a friendship while I was there, and he invited me. He was going to watch the Dalai Lama's oracle go into trance and speak. And so I went along with him, and it was in this little monastery with about 40 people, 40 monks, and Mick and I were the only Westerners in the place. And the monks started chanting, beating their drums. The person who channels the spirit entity called the Nechang Oracle is a 30-year-old monk by the name of Thupten Nordu. They brought him in, sat him down, put a heavy hat on his head, and immediately his eyes rolled back and he started, just going into this trance-like state and started speaking in a kind of a very high-pitched voice, kind of an unusual voice. And the monks were writing down everything he was saying. And then he more or less collapsed, and they had to help him out of the room. And so I was just watching that with big wide eyes. Yeah. I was wondering, is this a performance? Is this, what? I had no idea what it meant, or if this was a real thing, if he was really going and talking to spirits or channeling a spirit. Anyway, 2 days later, I got to interview him with Mick.
Okay.
And I sat in on the interview, and it was my first time I'd heard this. When they asked him, how were you chosen? He listed hearing voices, having personality changes. He talked about this electrical current that was like going up his spine, and it was just, very, he said it almost knocked me out when it would happen. I've since learned that's a Kundalini Awakening.
Kundalini Awakening.
And he didn't know what it was. He thought he was sick. He thought he was dying. And the monks around him said, no, you've got this, you've got a special gift here, a special sensitivity. I don't know the exact words, but he said the monks recognized something in me, and they started working with him. And well, now he is the main, they call these people that can do this, they call them Kutan in the Tibetan language. So he is the number one Kutan in Tibet now. He's 50. He was 30 when I met him back then. He's like 55 years old now. And he's very famous. You can Google him and watch him go into trance now.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So that was my introduction. And I just noticed that all these refugees coming out of Tibet, leaving their homeland, and many of them left because they had protested the occupation of their culture. And many of them had been imprisoned. But when they came in, even I've met some that had just come in the day before, they would be doing menial jobs in a restaurant, like mopping the floors. And I just thought, it takes 30 days to walk out over the Himalayas to get to Dharamsala, India, from Tibet. And here they were singing while they were working. And it was like they were, just in this, joyous state. And I thought, if I had to leave my homeland and leave my home and everything and my family and have to leave the country, and then doing a menial task to survive, would I be in this state of mind?
Phil, that's amazing, man. And so this taxi driver greets you. He gets you. He takes you to 4 places, 1 hour of looking for places. And then at the end of it, he leaves you with a smile and says, you don't owe me anything. Now there's these people who are displaced from their country. and they have to walk for 30 days and they come to a new country and now they're joyfully, seemingly with joy in their hearts doing menial work. Now, where does this joy come from? I mean, we see in the Western world, might not be the same in the Western world. And so what do you think it is that these people brings this joy, this sense of joy to these Tibetans' hearts, even when their home is displaced?
They have a devotion and practice that they do daily. I mean, most of them, in terms of their mantra, they're constantly repeating it, either with prayer beads or they use these little devices that they're turns,
mala,
prayer
right?
wheels, kind of that they're swinging, and they're chanting their mantra, Om Mani Padme Om. So they're more or less staying in this meditative state that brings them into the presence. But I've asked, and over the years, I've met people doing very radical things in terms of their devotion. I met a woman that was 90 years old that went into a cave to meditate when she was 12, and she's still in that cave meditating.
Wow.
I met people that are doing these pilgrimages, like 1,600 miles over mountains and doing it by prostrating, by holding their hands up to their heads, going down to the ground, touching their forehead on the ground, stretching the arms all the way out, then standing up and walking to where their fingertips were and doing it again. So like an inchworm going thousands of miles on their way. And so I would ask them, why? Why? What are you doing this?
Right.
And many of the times the answer was to get over self-grasping, self-cherishing. In other words, to get over ego, basically. To put that ego in a proper perspective in terms of your consciousness. That's the way I would interpret it now.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
I love that. Mantras for me is one of the quickest ways to quiet the mind. And 99% of all psychiatric conditions in the last 10 years, what I've noticed is when people come in identifying with their thoughts, as if their thoughts are true. And the mantras and the Kundalini, which we talked about a little bit earlier, were key components for me personally in my personal journey of quieting my mind, quieting the ego. And what we realize and understand, the Om Mani Padme Hum is a beautiful mantra that can quiet the mind and connect you with the universe, if you want to say, quiet the ego, which wants to be separate, and connect with the universal force. And this is the devotion that the Tibetans seem to carry for the devotion of unity, almost the devotion of wanting to get that ego quiet so there's no separation. And in that unity, they find that joy to be present no matter what's happening, which is so beautiful. Phil, I didn't mean to interrupt. I just wanted to ask you, though, you see in the Western world, when a child, they call it schizophrenia from the ages, or psychosis from the ages of 16 to 24 usually. And 1% of the entire population here can be diagnosed with that, starts hearing voices or goes into those trances or has those dizzy spells you were talking about that the Kutan had. Here in the Western world, what usually happens is they take them to a psychiatrist, and the psychiatrist puts them on medications which numb their chakras, their energy centers, so that they can continue to quote unquote function. But these meds don't solve the root issue. They cause more side effects. And then these side effects leads to more meds, which leads to hospitalizations where they're locked up. They're sometimes traumatized, injected with medications. And they go through this vicious cycle. And then the family also kind of doesn't understand what's happening. And you mentioned in some of these Eastern cultures that there's a different way of looking at it when a child starts hearing voices or having the shakes or starts having dizzy spells.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit more about that process of why the shaman and the community might look at it differently than the Western world in these Eastern cultures?
Well, yeah. I mean, first of all, I always say these young shaman, potential shaman, I should say, have so many advantages over somebody that goes into one of these non-ordinary states in our culture. First of all, they have a context that isn't frightened of these non-ordinary states. I mean, one of the biggest enemies of the mental stability of somebody going into one of these states is fear. And that fear, let me back up and just say this, what I've learned after interviewing well over 100 people, maybe 200, that have gone into these non-ordinary states spontaneously that we've classified as being psychosis. Number one, they tell me they have this sense of unity, the sense of being at one with everything, everyone and everything, being nothing but everything. They have a difficult time describing it because there's really no language in our culture to describe it. The other thing that happens is their sensitivity is like, they say it's like somebody turned up the volume on all the colors, on the sounds. My sensitivity went way up. I could feel the emotions of other people much more. They became sensitive to the energy around them much more. Their creativity went up. Synchronicities started happening more and more. Their inhibitions went down. So a lot of common things I've heard over and over again. But one of the things they say is when I tried to explain this to the people that loved me the most, my parents, my best friends, my wife, my husband, my boss, they didn't understand it and they got frightened. And that's when I got frightened.
I see.
Because they pick up on that fear. And that is like starts the downward spiral into what we call psychosis, the symptoms of just a lot of distress and eventually disability. So fear is a huge problem. And I talked to a psychiatrist once after I gave that talk, TED talk that you watched. He came up to me and he said, yeah, when I'm working with a patient, I realize I'm in this bubble of fear. The parents are frightened, the patient's frightened. I'm frightened because I'm not sure I know what to do. So that's a huge thing. And so back to what I was talking about. Number one, the advantage of a young shaman in an indigenous tribe is they don't get that hit of fear because there's this context that said you have this special sensitivity that can be worked with. You can be very valuable to our community. And secondly, they get a mentor. They get somebody who's been through that. Not just somebody who's read about it in a book. It's somebody who's actually gone through one of these experiences, an older shaman. And so they get that person as a guide. And then when they've gone through their initiation, they have a culture that values them. They don't look at them as a second-class broken citizen that has this handicap of a mental illness. So all that is totally different than what somebody that goes into that state in our culture, typically.
Beautiful. So the community doesn't outcast them. And in some ways, maybe even embrace their sensitivity. And so instead of seeing the sensitivity as a curse, they see it as a gift or an ability with the invisible world almost. And then a mentor who's been through it, who has experienced it, who's done the shadow work, can help and guide the young shaman or shamanist through this. And then eventually this is going to blossom into the gift of becoming a healer. Phil, can you talk to me about what you've noticed about the importance of community?
Oh, yeah. Thank you. Well, that's what I first noticed in going to all these small communities, either hunter-gatherer tribes or pastoralists or agriculturalists, but usually small communities of indigenous people. And by that, I mean people that have lived on a certain plot of land for centuries. And first of all, they have to have a strong community just to survive. And by that, I mean they have to have connections within that community, personal connections, intimate connections. They have no daycare centers. And so they take care of each other's children. If one woman has a baby that she's nursing and she has to go, go to herd her goats or go to the garden to work, and she wants somebody to take care of her baby, another woman will take care of that baby and start nursing. And she may pass it to a third woman who will nurse that baby. So they don't have daycare centers. They don't have old age homes. Extended families usually live together in these small huts. The grandparents and sometimes the great grandparents will be all together. And they take care of their elders personally. They don't hire attendants to do that. They don't have grocery stores, so they have to be connected to the land. They have to know it intimately to get the food they need to survive. They don't have lawyers to solve their arguments. They have to do that themselves. They have to work that out, and they have to work it out. It isn't like they can, okay, I'll never see that person again. Thank God he's out of my life or whatever. No, they've got to be with that person and work those things out. So their connections to each other are much more intimate than ours. That's one of the first things I noticed. The second thing was, their connection to the land. I've been on hunts with people down in the Amazon, and it's amazing what they can hear, what they can smell, what they know to get the food they need. And then they have a connection not only to each other, to the land, but they have this connection to themselves in that they don't, for one, they don't pathologize non-ordinary experience. They're comfortable with that. It's okay if you're going through that, but they're not bombarded with advertising. We don't realize how much we're influenced by this, seeing 3,000 ads, 4,000 ads a day, and telling us how to look, what we need to drive, what we need to be okay and successful. So just those connections they have to each other, to the land, and to themselves gives them a big mental health advantage.
Beautiful. I think the Western world is slowly starting to realize some of the wisdom that you just spoke from is that connection is the best medicine. A connection to nature, connection to ourselves. It releases oxytocin, which scientists are starting to realize balances dopamine and serotonin and increases endorphins, decreases pain. And the I in illness is for, I, but when you replace I with WE, it becomes wellness. And so connection and tribal community living is actually a beautiful thing. And one thing I also witnessed in Belize was there was an elderly population there living out in nature, and they didn't even need a psychiatrist there. They were, the family was involved and they were having visitors, and there were no kind of, if you want to say, problems with the elderly. And then I started working in a geriatric facility in the Western world, in the skilled nursing facility, where our elderly ancestors and parents are lined up in these rooms with poor circulation, no connection. And anytime they scream out for help, the current system is they call the psychiatrist and bombard them with more medications. Phil, from your travels and visiting, these Eastern cultures and the way they care for their elderly and the tribal livings, and then coming back to the Western world, which you have experienced in also, is there any wisdom that you can shed on how we might be able to incorporate some of these connection, tribal influences that are working, in Eastern cultures, and how we can slowly start infusing that into our medical system here in the Western world?
Yeah, I've thought about that a lot. But first, I want to say this, Samuel. I don't want to over-romanticize these cultures.
Sure.
I've gone into the Lower Omo Valley in Ethiopia, where there's 14 cultures in this one valley, living like they have for millennia, and with very little change. And within the tribe, there is this tight connection. And it's almost like if you get into disharmony with somebody and you cannot resolve it, you're in danger of being kicked out of the tribe.
Oh, wow.
So they have these 14 different tribes. And the thing is, these tribes are at war with one another. So what we've done here in the United States is brought a lot of tribes together, from different countries in Europe, from all over the world now. And we've managed to maintain some semblance of unity. But we're seeing a lot of tribalism raise its ugly head in our politics now, right? But we've worked on that. So, that's kind of a next stage.
Got it.
It's one thing to maintain this tight connection within a group of under 100 people, but it's another thing to try and maintain it with millions of people.
Sure.
So, again, I don't want to over-romanticize them, but going back to seeing where our brains evolved from. We evolved over 200,000 years, modern man, in hunter-gatherer groups of about 50 to 80 people. And that's what we're wired for. We're wired for connection of that type. And so how do we maintain that connection in our small communities, to have at least a small community of people that are connected in that way? Because if we have those intimate connections, if we just have a few people around us that we can be completely open to and bare our souls to, right? We can be okay. I've heard that from so many people going through this, what we call psychosis. If I had just one person that believed in me, that's all it took.
Yes.
And so so the question you've asked, how do we form these small communities of people that we can be open to, but yet not tribalize, not silo ourselves in those beliefs of that community, because that causes its own problems.
Sure.
So how do we do that? And I've thought about it a lot. I don't have the answers, but I've looked into co-housing, into communes and what makes a commune work and what makes it fail. I just started doing some of that work before COVID hit, and I was visiting different communes. But how are those communes governed? How do they handle conflict? And if they're living together, growing their food together in some of these permaculture communities, and they're sharing their resources, how is that governed? And what do you do with conflict? If somebody isn't doing their share of the work And this one commune I went into outside of Zurich, Switzerland, there were 2 women that were married that started this commune.
Mm.
And one of the women had fallen in love with one of the men in the commune.
Mm-hmm.
So there was this very intense personal triangle drama going on that had the potential to completely disrupt this community.
Mm-hmm.
And I was very interested in that. How were they going to solve this very human need for being, the number one, or everything that could come up in a triangle, right?
Sure.
How are they going to solve this? And I was there during part of that process, and it was very difficult. And it looked like it might completely disrupt this community.
Mm-hmm.
I've been in touch with them since that time, and they're slowly working this out. But those were the things I was interested in. How do you do that? How do you get back?
That's fascinating.
Yeah. So I have no answers, but I just know that we have to be careful of isolating ourselves, because our affluence allows us to be isolated. We can afford to live alone.
Yeah.
We can buy all our services. We can buy our daycare. We can buy our old age care. We have to be very careful of that.
There is a statistic that comes to my mind. When a child who is labeled as schizophrenic is given shelter, is given clothes, is given, doesn't have to worry about survival, and is given, just 2 or 3 people who treat them with sanity and accept them for who they are. There's a statistic that says about 2/3 of people can recover just based upon shelter, food supply, and 2 or 3 people who don't see them as an outcast, but like who embrace them. And so that goes to show how important this connection, community, and commune. I love that you're exploring communes. That's something I've been very fascinated about. And it reminds me of one, I probably read this somewhere, in one community where when someone sins or someone does something wrong or covets, or, the tribe gathers around them. And I don't know if this is true. I remember hearing this story, and he has a song, or she has a song, and the whole tribe will sing them a song, gather them in the middle and bless them, and try to help the soul remember who they really are. Yeah. What do you think about that, Phil? That process?
Yeah. Well, song in particular, dancing, singing. You know about the story in Rwanda of the therapists that were sent to Rwanda after the genocide?
I don't know the story. No.
Do you know about the big genocide in Rwanda?
Yes.
Millions slaughtered. Neighbors were killing each other.
Wow.
So they go through this huge trauma. And after it was brought to a halt, the genocide was brought to a halt, we, from the United States, sent several therapists over there to work with the people in terms of PTSD and all the trauma that they had taken in. And after about, I think the story went, after about 2 or 3 weeks, the people in Rwanda said, this isn't working. We need to, I'm sorry about this. Call from Washington. I should have turned that off. Sorry.
It's all good. No problem. Yeah.
Okay, that'll be it. So the people said, this isn't working. What we need to do is we need to get outside. They don't want to be in a room with one person, one-on-one talking. We need to go outside in the sunshine. We need to start drumming. We need to start singing. We need to start dancing. This is the way we solve our internal issues. And so it was just a whole different way of dealing with it. It wasn't up here in the head and talking it through. It was in the body, moving, singing and dancing.
Beautiful.
That they were getting over their trauma.
That's so scientific. I love that you said that, Phil, because trauma is stored in the body. And what we're starting to realize, these emotions are stored in the body. And now all this evidence is coming to light about the scientific healing properties of drumming, the rhythm of drumming, and the scientific benefits of being in the sun and dancing. And even with Alzheimer's clients, like, souls, the last thing they forget is music. And sound is the medicine of the future, because in the beginning, God said, let there be light. And if you want to heal anything, go to where it first started with sound, vibration. Sound became an atom, and atom became, a molecule. And so can you tell me a little bit about just what you've witnessed with sound and the healing properties of sound during your travels, Phil?
Yeah, well, I've heard it in all different forms. Of course, drumming is very big. In fact, many of the shaman induced their trance with the drum. Mongolia and Siberia, Native Americans do it. But the sounds are different in different cultures, of course, and the singing is different. In Mongolia and Siberia, they have the throat singers. Have you ever heard them?
I've heard about them, yeah.
Yeah, and but in the Amazon, they use plant medicines like ayahuasca a lot. I've been around tribes down there that use that, and that puts the person basically into a state similar to psychosis, where the ego is sort of disabled. And you end up feeling that connection to everyone and everything when that separate sense goes away. That sense of yourself as being separate from everything else goes away. But a very important part of that, using those plant medicines, is the song that the shaman sings. They call them icaros. And that is a very important part of the process. And now all the research that's being done in universities around the world, I don't know if you're aware of this, but there's this huge renaissance in research around psychedelics and inducing these states. And the music that they're choosing in these research programs is very, very critical to the success of the therapy. Yeah. And they're using these states as therapy for treatment-resistant depression, PTSD, OCD, eating disorders, end-of-life anxieties. And it's all being studied at major universities like Johns Hopkins, Imperial College in London, UCLA, NYU. It's kind of amazing.
So, Phil, you were talking about the research that is being done on plant medicine at some really esteemed kind of universities across. Can you share with us what is being found?
Well, this gets into a large discussion because it gets into the neuroscience of what they're finding. I don't know if you want to hear about that. But the main university I've done most of my interviews in, and they're on my website, by the way, is Imperial College in London.
Okay.
And they're headed by a young guy by the name of Robin Carhart Harris. I say young, he's 40 years old, but he's started this program, I think about 8 years ago. And I was so surprised to see this renaissance in looking at these compounds after they had been deemed illegal for almost 30 years. And even though many of these compounds have been used for centuries in these indigenous and tribal communities around the world, But basically, the thing that probably be the most interesting to you is so some of them are natural plant medicines and some of them have been synthesized in laboratories.
Okay.
LSD is one that was synthesized in a laboratory in Switzerland in 1940 by a biochemist working for a pharmaceutical company called Sandoz. His name was Albert Hofmann. And so he found this compound that he was working on a compound to use in women after childbirth to help the uterus shrink back, because postpartum bleeding is a big cause of maternal mortality in childbirth, especially in places that don't have access to modern medical facilities. So he was working on this compound and he got some under his fingernail and it produced this, this visions and different things going on in his mind that was very strange. So he started using it to see what it was. And when they first named it, they called it a psychomimetic. And it means mimicking a psychosis. And as time went on and they were using it more and more in therapy, and until it was deemed illegal, it was used in therapy quite a bit, especially in Europe, and with a great deal of success. It became the word, they changed it to psychedelic, which means mind revealing. In other words, what happens under a psychedelic and often in a psychotic episode is childhood memories can come up. And you tap into that subconscious part of your brain. Sometimes if you've had a trauma in childhood, that will be blocked from your conscious mind. And as those memories come up, if you can deal with them, if you can be with that feeling and not run from it and not be frightened by it, but actually just experience it for the feeling it is, you can many times undo those blockages that are caused by those unresolved traumas from your past. And that's how these compounds were being used. So I forget your question, actually. No,
that was perfect, because that actually delved into probably one of the most important things about mental health, period, is childhood trauma. And making the subconscious mind conscious, and then being with the emotion rather than being afraid of it, to go into it with healthy curiosity and to, like a visitor, to see what it's trying to teach us. And so I'm really actually super ecstatic that you brought that up. And Dr. Gabor Mate always says, in any addiction, the question is not what is the addiction, but what is the childhood trauma? What is the pain? Phil, can you talk to us a little bit more about what you're seeing about childhood trauma through your travels and through your experiences, and how that manifests, and just any thoughts about that? And mental health and childhood trauma.
Yeah, well, what I've learned about childhood trauma has come since my travels, because I never was sophisticated enough in my language and going through translators to talk about things like childhood trauma to the shaman I met.
Sure.
In fact, when I was doing that work, that was just a sidelight to my human rights work. And so if I had to do it over again, and knowing where I've ended up now, I would have asked all those questions. But that's, I didn't. But so since I got involved, and the way I got involved in making this film called CrazyWise is I met somebody who had, at 20 years old, a psychotic break. He was labeled bipolar. And I followed him for 6 years, and that became this movie, CrazyWise. And I learned so much about the mental health crisis in our country. You know, the fact that depression is on this steep logarithmic,
yeah.
sorry, logarithmic.
We get it. Yeah.
And that suicides, especially in young people, are on the same trajectory. There's been a 24% rise in the last 14 years. Wow. I mean, that's huge.
Yeah.
And so I didn't know about all this. But once I started following Adam, the guy I met, and that's a whole other story, how I started this film. But anyway, since I've been doing that and interviewing many people like Adam who have had these breaks from reality, so to say, the reality we know, I've learned just so much about that. And again, I've lost my track of the original question. So if you could ask me
that's okay. Childhood trauma, just childhood trauma. And
childhood trauma, yes.
Yeah,
well, almost everybody that I've talked to, either that childhood trauma triggered their episode, or they got into learning more about it after they had their episode. More of it came up. And childhood trauma can be revealed by going into one of these episodes, or by taking psychedelics, or by meditating in extreme meditation retreats like Vipassana retreats. Adam realized his grandfather had molested him in a meditation retreat. So anytime this part of the brain that has been identified, and it's called the default mode network, is relaxed, when that network is relaxed, it is the gateway to the subconscious. It's now believed by neuroscientists that it somehow controls those memories that are just a little bit too hard for the ego to handle. And essentially, what excites me is they've discovered where our sense of being separate as a separate self, separate from the whole, where that concept is housed in the brain, in what network it's housed.
Please do tell, Phil.
Well, have you heard of the default mode network?
I have, yes.
And there's so much research going on in regard to the default mode network that was just discovered at University of Washington in 2001, I believe. Wow. It's a recent discovery, and they've discovered it with fMRI imaging. And fMRI can measure blood flow in the brain. And so they started noticing different parts of the brain start interacting or start becoming active together under certain conditions. And so I don't know all the tests that they've done in the specific methodology, but they've identified the default mode network to be responsible for our sense of time, our sense of our what they call our self-referential self, our sense of who we are, how we put that concept together. And it also, they believe, is the gateway to, it controls the gateway to our past memories, especially traumatic memories. And most importantly, so that network creates what is called predictive coding. So when we look at reality, we look through our past experiences. all that raw data coming into our visual and auditory sensors and our proprioception and our taste, all those in our five senses, all that data comes in and is interpreted. So we don't really see reality as that raw data presents itself. We see our interpretation of it. And it's heavily influenced by our past experiences. Like a baby does not have all these predictive codes built into it when they are born. They see reality for what it is, the raw data that we're equipped to see anyway. But as we learn, and especially language, especially our culture influences, I, me, mine, all that stuff, we start to form this concept. One of the predictive codes is our ego, our concept of being a separate self, which if you talk to the Tibetan Buddhists or any Buddhist, they let you know that the self is an illusion. And I always wondered, what does that mean? The self is an illusion. Well, now the scientists are beginning to see that, that concept of being separate is a it's a construct. It's a I don't know how else to put it, but long story short, psychedelics, and I believe a psychosis, long-term meditation, put to sleep the default mode network or partially disable it. So you can get the sense of not being so separate in a psychedelic state or in a psychotic state, quote unquote, or in deep meditation. You take these monks that have meditated for 100,000 hours and you put them in an fMRI machine, and their default mode networks are very, very relaxed. There's not much activity going on. The reason they call it the default mode network is that's our default state. Our default state is going into kind of the monkey mind. Our thoughts are constantly churning, and we start identifying with those thoughts. But when that is quieted down, either with meditation or again, psychedelics, or even extreme athletes, they go into what they call the flow state. That's quieting that network down. I'm not really doing justice to that. You'd have to get a good neuroscientist online here.
I think you killed it. I think you just explained it beautifully, scientifically as well. And, science is the modern language of spirituality. So if I may, just from what I'm hearing from my perception, is, when there's childhood trauma that occurs, there's a fracture, not only in the shamanic world, they might call it a fracture of the soul, but also a fracture of the brain. Perhaps different parts of the brain stop communicating with a certain part of the brain. And there's an area there which, wants to be separate, a subconscious memory, which under the influence of certain, functional MRI can measure, is the whole brain communicating with each other? And if it's not, there's been a fracture and some type of default mode network, which is blocking off a memory or blocking off blood flow to a certain part of the brain. And so a lot of these problems are childhood trauma issues and then under functional MRI, we can see it. And then when we get into these states, whether it's on psychedelics, whether it's through holotropic breath work, whether it's through deep Vipassana meditation, the default network is gone. Now the whole blood is flowing into the whole brain, can communicate with each other. So these subconscious childhood memories, which had fractured the soul, can be revealed and be made conscious again. And the body can feel safe enough to come into a state of unity where the fractured part of the soul can also be kind of brought back into a state of wholeness if the default network is gone and there's a state of unity, there's a state of safety, there's a state of oneness. And so I actually, really followed what you were saying. And, I think there's such deep wisdom there that we could probably write a whole book about.
Yeah, and it's so exciting that science is coming around, and there's almost this bridge being built to the spiritual. And by the way, when I use the term spiritual, I always have to define it for my own.
Sure.
And for me, it's anything that connects us to the whole is a spiritual process. Anything. So I grew up in a religion this is the only true church.
Me too, yeah.
That's not spiritual.
Can I ask what religion?
Mormon.
Oh, Seventh-day Adventist. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, anytime you hear that, that's the ego in the church. And I loved when I went to Tibet and the Buddhists, and I got to interact with the Dalai Lama at times, and it's you take what works for you out of this. That's the only thing here for you in our Buddhist tradition.
I love that.
Is what's going to work for you. If it works for you, it's true for you. Use it. Other than that, use whatever else that gives you that peace of mind or that sense of compassion for others and that sense of connection.
I love that. Yeah. That's so beautiful. Just take what works for you. And spirituality is consciousness and awareness. And the soul just wants to be free is what I'm learning. And that separation, that sense of separation is what keeps it from being free. Phil, I just want to ask a final few questions here. For a family who has a child who starts having these voices, and they don't know what to do, given that you made this beautiful documentary, you've seen kind of both sides, what kind of advice would you have for a family that is having a child just about to start going through this process? Yeah,
that's such an important thing. It is a frightening thing. You have a child that you love so much, and all of a sudden they can change into a different way of seeing the world.
Yeah.
And it can be scary. And we created the film, then I created a website, the website CrazyWiseFilm.com, and we have a whole list of resources. One of the resources I really like was Families Healing Together. It was started by a woman by the name of Krista McKinnon, who herself had one of these episodes and had to work through it almost on her own.
Wow.
And so she started a network where families can go to this network and anonymously share with other families that are going through it.
Beautiful.
And talk about what they're doing, what works, what doesn't work. And just to be able to talk about it, because there's so much shame around it that usually when something like this happens, it isolates the family. They don't want to talk to their neighbors or their coworkers or whoever because of the shame and stigma around these episodes. And so that's one that comes to mind. But we've listed several. We have a resource page.
Beautiful.
We've listed several others there. And so I usually recommend that they check
And what
out.
is that website? Can you tell everybody watching what that website is?
Yeah,
where they
it's
can find
crazy.
It's
CrazyWise, CrazyWiseFilm.com.
CrazyWiseFilm.com.
Then you could, if you wanted to see the film, there's the trailer there. There's also CrazyWise Conversations, where I do conversations much like you're doing. I eventually probably might start a podcast.
Awesome.
But I'm debating that. But anyway, there's a lot of resources on that page, and I don't have them all memorized. But when we vet something that we have heard from several people that works, we put it in our resources.
Beautiful. So CrazyWiseFilm.com, a list of resources, families healing together, where families can talk to each other and not have shame, no blame, no shame and just talk about what they're going through, open dialogue. Beautiful, beautiful. Phil, I've seen a few of your photographs. Can you tell our amazing, first of all, photographs, what a gift. I received a photograph from, it's a gift when you can show the eyes are the window to the soul, when you can give a photograph or show a photograph of someone and it like almost shows their soul in a different way. And I found that photographs are one of the best gifts. Phil, where can our, listeners access some of your work and some of your photographs?
Oh, yeah. Phil Borges. My last name is Borges, philborges.com.
Okay.
And you can see all my previous work with indigenous and tribal people around the world. And I've done several different projects around that theme.
Beautiful. So philborges.com, crazywisefilm.com, Families Healing Together. Anything else, any other work you're doing, Phil, that you want to let our listeners know about? And
well, yeah, I mean, this, Samuel, this is probably the most captivating thing I'm doing for myself.
Beautiful. Yeah.
I mean, I am just so interested in this whole world of spirituality, the world of connection and interconnection, and all the new science that's building around it, and it's just fascinating to me. And so I don't know what I'm going to do next. COVID has given me a break for a period of time. I live up in Seattle, so we have this beautiful bunch of mountains around us, and I'm out hiking a lot. Amazing. So I'm just taking a break right now and thinking about what I'm doing next. But like you, I'm thinking a podcast might be a way to go, because people can consume it while they're driving, and I can do it without having to fly someplace. I've done so much traveling. I feel a little bit guilty about it, contributing to the carbon footprint as much as I have. But that might be the way I'm going to go next.
Beautiful. I love it. Yeah. What a beautiful, fascinating time. And, I got to ask you this, Phil, with, you started your journey 30, 40 years ago about human liberation. And here we are in this global period of, with the virus and all these things happening. Any words of wisdom for people during this global time, unusual time, when it comes to freedom and when it comes to human rights? Anything from your perspective you want to say about that?
Yeah, well, it's just like what we've been talking about through this whole podcast is a crisis. Within a crisis, there's always an opportunity. Mm-hmm. And I see many opportunities. One, just cutting off our use of fossil fuels for a couple of weeks. People in China were seeing the stars, 30 and 40-year-old people were seeing the stars for the first time in their lives. There was so much pollution in some of the cities there. Having to take this time off and just reflect. And probably what we're seeing in terms of human rights here in the United States and the whole issue of police brutality. We had to open up that conversation at some point. And it can go too far to one side or too far to the other side. But opening that conversation, and so we can meet in the middle and get a more just society, a less prejudiced, get out of our predictive codes when we're looking at each other. All that is, I think it's healthy. I think it's a healthy change, and usually it takes a crisis to change, to transform.
Love it. Love it. Beautiful. with chaos comes opportunity to look within, opportunity for open dialogue, opportunity to improve our culture. Last thing I'll ask is there one thing that you can recommend to whoever's watching this? Maybe like one thing that they can do, like a practical tip that they can take into their life that you found to be useful for you, no matter what it is, whether it's, one practical tip that users can take away, the listeners, and practice this and see if it can help your life.
Ooh, it's like a spiritual practice.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I meditate. That's what I do. Okay. I'm interested in doing a psychedelic, but that's not a practice. That's an event to open you in a certain way, under a controlled circumstance. But yeah, the practice I do is just stopping and listening and feeling and being present as a daily practice. And during the day, dropping into that state periodically, not just when I'm sitting in the morning on a cushion, but actually getting into that state purposefully several times during the day. So that's what I'm doing. It's a slow process, but I think, it's bearing fruit. I've been doing it many years.
That's beautiful. I love that. Thank you so much. So stop, breathe, feel, drop into the present moment several times, not only in the morning when you meditate, but several times during the day, and find that present moment. Well, Phil, I just want to thank you from the bottom of my heart for your journeys, for your soul, for your truth, and for your voice, and the work that you're doing. So much gratitude. Thank you so much.
Vice versa, Samuel. This was a great, great interview. And I had no idea who you were. And I was so pleasantly surprised. I thought you would be like 80 years old for some reason. I don't know why.
It was.
But well, thank you for the work you're doing, and send me some information more on the work besides this podcast. Well, I didn't get to learn too much about you, and
definitely. I'd love to stay connected.
Right?
I'm a practicing psychiatrist for the last 10 years. I wrote a book called The Spiritual Guide to Mental Health, and now it's my vision to create, if you want to say, mental health communes around the world. This is my vision currently, that take the latest, the ancient Eastern technologies, also combined with some of the more Western technologies, and combine them together to see if we can, help change the global paradigm of mental health is kind of what I'm working on these days. And, just
Spiritual Guide to Mental Health.
The Spiritual Guide to Mental Health. Yeah.
Great.
You can download it for free on www.thespiritualpsychiatrist.com.
Okay.
And that's
Could you send me some of these links?
Yeah, I'll send it to you for sure.
Yeah.
Phil. I would love to. Yeah. And I got to just one more time, just shout out for anybody watching this. CrazyWise is, when I was watching this, as 10 years as a psychiatrist, what took me 10 years to figure out truths about the system, truths about what's happening in our young people, in our system, in the Eastern world. In this film, I've never watched a film that so elegantly, naturally, and gracefully uncovered these truths and gave this perspective in such a way that every single truth almost was covered, but in a natural flowing state, while telling the story of two young, beautiful people. So I just want to really, from my heart, recommend watching this film, CrazyWise, to gain a different perspective about mental health. And I think there's a lot of hidden gems and jewels in this beautiful film. So just really want to recommend that with all my heart.
Thank you so much, Samuel.